The night was supposed to be ordinary, calm, predictable, but sometimes, life has a way of shattering expectations in an instant. Imagine driving along a quiet road, your thoughts tangled between the past and the future, when suddenly everything changes. The world spins, metal crumples, and one moment of distraction becomes a memory that will haunt you forever. This is the tragic story of Prince Harry, a life marked by privilege, courage, and public adoration, suddenly thrust into a nightmare no one could have predicted. The kind of tragedy that leaves questions echoing long after the sirens fade. The kind of tragedy that changes a person and a family forever. The first question that comes to mind is simple, yet haunting. What would it feel like to have your life, your identity, your very sense of self, hang in the balance after a car crash? Prince Harry, the once carefree royal, suddenly faced a fragility most people only encounter in fleeting moments of fear. But the shock wasn't just in the accident itself, it was in what came after. The media frenzy, the family tensions, the inner turmoil that no headline could capture. And as we dig deeper, you will begin to understand why this story isn't just another celebrity mishap. It is a glimpse into the raw human experience of survival, guilt, and transformation. But before the crash, the night was filled with a tension that few could see. Prince Harry had been wrestling with questions that went far beyond palace walls. He was thinking about duty, freedom, love, and legacy. There were moments of doubt, moments of quiet rebellion, moments when the weight of expectation pressed down so heavily that even the most seasoned observer would notice the strain. He moved through the evening with a smile for cameras and friends, but inside, a storm was gathering. It's a paradox so many of us recognize. To the world, everything looks fine. To the individual, the ground is already shifting beneath their feet. Now, think about the crash itself. A car, traveling at the speed that seems manageable in daylight, becomes a weapon in darkness. A fraction of a second decides fate. Who could have predicted the trajectory, the slippery road, the sudden swerve? And yet, as shocking as the accident was, the true tragedy was only beginning to unfold. Survival came, but survival is never the end. Survival carries weight, physical pain, emotional trauma, and the invisible scars that no one sees. Prince Harry's recovery was not just about mending bones and bruised skin. It was about navigating a world that was suddenly unrecognizable. Friends, family, the press, all became actors in a drama that was bigger than any of them imagined. You may ask, why does this matter now? Why is a car accident involving a member of the royal family a story worth exploring in depth? The answer is not just in the sensational headlines, though those certainly exist. It is in the human truth that lies beneath. The collision between expectation and reality, between public persona and private pain. Prince Harry's experience mirrors the experiences of millions who face trauma in silence, who are forced to reconcile what the world sees with what they feel. But when you layer on the pressures of royalty, the scrutiny of a global media, and the complex dynamics of family loyalty, the story becomes not just tragic, but profoundly compelling. The media response was immediate. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled, social media erupted. But what the cameras captured was surface level, the flashing lights, the official statements, the rehearsed expressions. What they did not capture was the silence in the hospital room, the whispered conversations behind closed doors, the internal monologues of someone coming to terms with a near-death experience. Imagine lying in that hospital bed, hearing fragments of news stories, knowing the world is watching, and trying to process what just happened. It is a paradoxical mix of isolation and exposure, and it is something that would shape Prince Harry in ways no one could have predicted. Even within the family, reactions varied dramatically. Some were filled with concern, others with frustration, and some with a quiet, almost imperceptible judgment. The dynamics of royalty are such that every emotion is scrutinized, every action dissected. And in this environment, Prince Harry had to navigate not just his own trauma, but the expectations and reactions of those closest to him. It's a form of pressure that most of us cannot even imagine, yet it makes the stakes of the accident even higher. This was not just about healing physically. It was about finding a place in a world that suddenly felt both familiar and alien. But there were also contradictions that made the story even more compelling. On one hand, Prince Harry had always been portrayed as courageous, sometimes reckless, often irreverent. On the other hand, the accident revealed vulnerabilities that few had seen before. The contrast between the public image and private reality is stark, almost jarring. It forces us to reconsider the narratives we accept about people in the public eye. And it also makes us wonder, what else remains hidden behind the carefully curated appearances? What secrets, what choices, what consequences linger in the shadows, waiting to emerge? As we explore the hours leading up to the crash, the moments during it, and the aftermath, you will notice a recurring theme: tension. It is in the subtle glances, the rushed decisions, the small, seemingly inconsequential choices that lead to monumental outcomes. Prince Harry's story is a case study in how fragile life can be, how quickly certainty can crumble, and how resilience is forged in the fire of unexpected catastrophe. And through it all, there is the undeniable human question: how do you rebuild after everything you thought you knew is shaken to its core? The curiosity gap widens when we consider the hidden elements of this story. There were witnesses whose accounts never made headlines, security personnel whose observations were classified, and details that contradict initial reports. And as you will see, these contradictions are not just minor footnotes. They shape the narrative in ways that are both surprising and deeply affecting. What seemed like a simple accident evolves into a complex tapestry of human emotion, public pressure, and private struggle. Every revelation builds on the last, each twist raising more questions than it answers, and that is exactly what keeps us engaged, questioning, and invested. But perhaps the most poignant part of the introduction is this: survival is not the same as victory. Prince Harry lived through the crash, yes, but the emotional and psychological aftermath would test him in ways nothing else had. Trauma leaves footprints, subtle but enduring. The story of the accident is just the beginning. The true journey is in the recovery, the confrontation with fear, the navigation of family dynamics, and the reconciliation of public and private identities. This is a story about human fragility, resilience, and the unexpected ways life can change in a single instant. And so, we arrive at the edge of the story's beginning. The night, the crash, the initial shock. These are the pieces we hold as we prepare to delve deeper. What happened inside that car? How did Prince Harry respond in those first critical moments? How did the world react? And what truths were hidden behind carefully constructed narratives? These are the questions that will guide us through the chapters ahead, each revealing more than the last, each building tension, each drawing us closer to understanding not just the accident, but the person at its center. As you watch and listen, ask yourself, what would you do if your life changed in a single, irreversible moment? How would you cope with the collision of private pain and public scrutiny? And most importantly, what secrets remain buried beneath the headlines, waiting for someone to uncover them? The answers, as we will see, are as complex as they are heartbreaking, and the story is only just beginning. But the next hours, the moments before the crash, hold their own suspense. There were decisions, hesitations, and seemingly mundane events that converged to set the stage for a night that would forever alter Prince Harry's life. And as we move forward, you will begin to see the threads of tension weaving together, preparing us for the moment when everything changed and nothing would ever be the same. The introduction closes here, leaving us on the precipice of the first chapter, the hours leading up to the crash. What choices were made? What warnings were ignored? And what, ultimately, was unavoidable? The answers lie just ahead, and what comes next would change everything, in ways no one saw coming. The evening began quietly, deceptively normal. Prince Harry, like so many nights before, moved through the royal estate with the practiced ease of someone who knew every corridor, every painting, every silent observer lurking just out of sight. Yet tonight, beneath the surface of normalcy, tension had begun to coil like a snake, ready to strike. It is often said that tragedy arrives quietly, in the smallest moments. The seemingly insignificant choices, the brief distractions, the tiny deviations from routine. And in the hours leading up to the accident, every one of these moments mattered. Harry's day had started early. The sun barely kissed the horizon when he was already awake. moving through his morning ritual with the precision that comes from years of public scrutiny. He had meetings, obligations, calls to make, appearances to rehearse. Even a casual comment could be twisted into a headline. But even as he went through the motions, a sense of unease lingered. There was a heaviness in his chest, a nagging worry that perhaps something was out of place. The question no one could see: was he ready for what was coming? By mid-afternoon, the weight of public expectation had pressed in further. He attended a charity meeting, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, flashing smiles for the cameras that were always ready. The irony was never lost on him. To the world, he was the picture of composure and poise. Behind the scenes, though, there was a storm raging. Decisions about travel, logistics, personal safety, they all rested on a fragile balance, and any misstep could be catastrophic. Every conversation, every gesture, every glance carried the subtle tension of someone straddling two worlds, one public, one intensely private. As evening approached, Harry's mood began to shift. It was subtle at first. An eye that lingered too long, a frown that appeared when no one was looking, a hesitancy in movement. His mind wandered, replaying past conflicts, future uncertainties, and the strange isolation that comes from being constantly observed. Even surrounded by family or friends, he felt a distance, a separation between the person he showed to the world and the one he truly was. And that separation, that quiet vulnerability, would soon intersect with fate in a way he could never have predicted. The drive itself had been planned as routine, a short trip from one location to another, meant to be uneventful, yet laden with unspoken pressure. The vehicle was luxurious, equipped with the latest safety features, yet it could not insulate him from human error or from the sudden chaos that would erupt. He had taken this route countless times before, familiar with every bend, every streetlight, every potential hazard. And yet, experience offers no guarantees when circumstances shift in ways one cannot anticipate. There were moments during the drive that seemed insignificant at the time. A glance at a rearview mirror, a brief check of a phone, a fleeting distraction. In hindsight, these were the seeds of catastrophe. Human perception is fragile, and even a fraction of a second's lapse can change everything. Prince Harry, despite his training, his awareness, and his years of navigating scrutiny, could not foresee the chain of events that were about to unfold. Around him, the world continued in oblivious motion. Streetlights flickered, pedestrians moved along the sidewalks, a distant siren wailed. But these were background details, easily ignored until they became urgent, life-altering signals. The night carried a deceptive calm, the kind that blankets tragedy before it strikes. And in that calm, the prince's thoughts were a whirlwind, past regrets, fleeting doubts, private fears. It is a peculiar phenomenon, the way a mind can oscillate between mundane concerns and life-altering anticipation without the observer realizing it. An hour before the crash, subtle signs began to appear. Tires made a slight squeal on a wet patch of road. The radio briefly crackled with static. A conversation in the back seat momentarily drew his attention away from the road. Each of these incidents, minor in isolation, compounded like drops forming a storm cloud. And while the human mind often discounts small warning signs, in this case, they were precursors to a calamity that would leave an indelible mark. At this point, Harry's emotions were a mixture of concentration, fatigue, and distraction. The combination of mental strain and physical tiredness creates a fragile mental state, one that can make even experienced drivers susceptible to miscalculations. Observers often underestimate the cognitive load involved in balancing constant public scrutiny with ordinary personal concerns. Harry, like many in positions of high responsibility, was simultaneously managing multiple streams of attention, planning, monitoring, anticipating, while carrying the invisible weight of personal anxiety. The drive was uneventful in most ways, yet the tension in the car was palpable. The passengers exchanged brief, clipped comments, each sensing the heightened awareness that precedes something unexpected. There is a psychological phenomenon known as anticipatory anxiety, a sense of unease about a future event that has not yet occurred. It is subtle but powerful, affecting reaction times, judgment, and perception. Harry and those around him may have been experiencing exactly this, unaware of how it would intersect with reality. As the car approached the critical stretch of road, the environment itself seemed to shift. The road narrowed slightly. A patch of ice, or perhaps just a sheen from recent rain, caught the wheels at an angle. Streetlights cast long, distorted shadows, creating the illusion of movement where there was none. And in that brief, almost imperceptible moment, the world changed. A flick of the wheel, a subtle adjustment, and the first domino in a sequence of events set the stage for disaster. There is an element of human psychology that is particularly poignant in the moments before a crisis. We rarely recognize the gravity of a situation until it has already passed. For Harry, the first signs of trouble were subtle, a slight skid, a quick instinctive correction, but they were enough to set off a cascade of reactions that would culminate in a crash. Time, perception, and decision-making interact in mysterious ways, and in high-stakes environments, even the smallest hesitation can carry enormous consequences. It is impossible to overstate the role of human choice in this sequence. Every action, every glance, every second of inattention contributed to the eventual outcome. And yet, it is equally impossible to ignore the element of fate, the cruel, random force that places ordinary humans in extraordinary situations. The collision of human error, environmental conditions, and sheer chance created a perfect storm, one that would test Harry's resilience in ways no one could have imagined. In these hours before the crash, there were also private thoughts that few would ever know. The fear of failure, the sense of obligation, and the desire to maintain composure all competed for attention. Prince Harry was not just driving a car. He was navigating a lifetime of expectations, a web of relationships, and the delicate balance of personal survival versus public duty. It is in these quiet, unseen moments that the human experience is most vividly revealed. By the time the critical moment arrived, the tension had reached a peak. The senses are heightened, reflexes sharpened, and yet the mind can become trapped between action and anticipation. What happened next would define not only the night, but the trajectory of Harry's life. One wrong turn, one miscalculation, one twist of fate, and everything would change in an instant. And that moment arrived with the subtlety of inevitability. The car lurched. The tires lost traction. Instinct took over, but instinct alone was not enough. In that instant, the boundary between control and chaos dissolved. And while Harry would survive, the path ahead was anything but certain. At this point, the hours before the crash close with a tension that cannot be overstated. Everything up to this moment, the day's routines, the minor distractions, the environmental factors, had converged to set the stage for the event that would follow. The world outside remained unaware, ordinary, indifferent, while inside the car, history had already begun to pivot. And yet, the true story is only beginning. The crash itself, the immediate aftermath, and the ripple effects that followed would reveal not just the fragility of human life, but the complexities of fame, family, and personal transformation. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The seconds stretched like hours. In an instant, the familiar routine of the evening was replaced by a chaos so sudden, so violent, it defied comprehension. Prince Harry, alert and experienced, felt the shift immediately. The subtle vibration beneath the tires, the sharp twist of the steering wheel, the momentary loss of control. It was enough to trigger every training he had ever received, every instinct honed by years of public life and personal trials. Yet instinct alone could not undo what was unfolding. The car's tires skidded across the slick pavement, a high-pitched screech cutting through the otherwise quiet night. Lights blurred, reflections fractured against rain-slicked asphalt, and shadows twisted in impossible angles. Every detail became exaggerated, magnified by the mind in hyper-awareness. The faint smell of rubber burning, the sudden jerk of the seat beneath him, the sharp clatter of objects tumbling in the back of the car. To anyone outside, it may have looked like a fleeting slip, but to those inside, it was an instant of pure terror, each millisecond a test of will and reflex. Prince Harry's hands gripped the wheel with white-knuckled intensity. Thoughts raced as fast as the vehicle. Control. Don't panic. Breathe. Focus. Training met fear in an intense clash. He tried to correct the skid, adjusting the wheel just slightly, microseconds too late. The car swerved, fishtailing in a way that defied expectation, careening toward the edge of the road. Every decision became amplified, every movement critical. Even the slightest hesitation could mean the difference between a controlled stop and catastrophe. At that exact moment, the world outside the car seemed suspended. Streetlights blurred into streaks of gold and white. The rain fell in sheets, drenching the asphalt, adding an unpredictable slipperiness that made every correction both vital and dangerous. A pedestrian's silhouette flashed briefly, a ghostly figure that vanished before it could even register. For Harry, the sensory overload was immense. Every nerve screamed, every sense heightened to near breaking point. And yet, the mind, though racing, had to remain clear enough to act, to survive. Then came the impact. Metal twisted, glass shattered. The sound was immediate, jarring, almost impossibly loud. The cacophony of destruction condensed into a single, horrifying instant. It was the collision of expectation and reality, a violent punctuation in a night that had started with ordinary, banal moments. The car jolted violently, the seatbelt constricting, a sudden and brutal reminder of both human fragility and mechanical protection. The force of it threw everyone inside off balance, a chaotic ballet that left no one untouched. In that moment, time itself seemed to fracture. Harry's mind, trained to observe, to respond, struggled to process the sensory overload. The smell of scorched rubber mingled with the faint scent of fuel, and every nerve fired simultaneously in a desperate bid to comprehend the impossible. Was this the end? Could he survive this? Questions flashed, unbidden, unanswerable in the chaos. The physical trauma was only part of it. The psychological weight, the realization of mortality, was immediate, intrusive, and inescapable. Passengers in the back experienced their own surge of terror. Hands gripped seats and handles as the world tumbled sideways. Shouts mixed with the noise of twisting metal. Each individual had their own calculus in that instant. What could be done, what needed to be done, and what, terrifyingly, could not be done. Harry, though central to the chaos, was not isolated in his fear. The shared panic, the collective struggle to maintain presence of mind, heightened the intensity of every heartbeat, every breath. Then came the moments immediately after the crash, the seconds when survival hangs in a delicate balance between relief and dread. The car, though damaged, had not fully overturned. The seats had done their work, the airbags had deployed as intended. Yet the world outside the car had become alien. Rain poured in through fractured windows. The night, once ordinary, was now transformed into a scene of devastation. Silence and sound alternated violently. The sudden quiet of impact, followed by the muffled cries and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Harry's body ached. Pain radiated in sharp, unpredictable waves. Limbs were jolted into awkward angles. His head spun slightly from the violent motion. And yet, amid the physical agony, there was a sharper, more insidious awareness. Survival alone was no guarantee. There were unknowns still lingering. Injuries invisible at first, dangers of fire or secondary impact, and the realization that once the car came to rest, the next few moments would define everything. His first actions were deliberate, measured. He checked his own condition, noting aches and bruises, the clarity of consciousness, the functionality of limbs. Then came concern for others, the passengers in the back, anyone else who might have been involved. Each assessment was critical. Panic could easily escalate to paralysis, and in emergencies, clarity is a rare commodity. Harry's training, his instinct, and his determination converged to create a thread of agency amid the chaos. Outside, the environment had transformed. The rain fell heavier now, drumming against the crumpled metal like an accusing rhythm. Headlights from other vehicles flickered on, strangers drawn to the scene. The world was now a mixture of observers and potential rescuers, each acting according to their own understanding of the situation. And in the midst of this, Harry faced a psychological paradox. He had survived the mechanical violence of the crash, but now he had to navigate the social and procedural fallout. Every decision mattered. Every choice carried weight. Then came the first signs of rescue. Voices shouted through the rain. Hands reached through broken windows to assist, and the distant blare of sirens grew louder, signaling the arrival of professionals trained for moments like this. Harry's presence of mind remained astonishing. Despite the trauma, he communicated, coordinated, and assessed. The adrenaline coursing through him sharpened his reflexes, even as exhaustion began to whisper at the edges of consciousness. Yet amid this controlled chaos, the mind cannot help but wander. Harry's thoughts flickered between disbelief, gratitude, fear, and a dawning recognition. His life had irrevocably changed in a matter of seconds. Every experience, every memory, every relationship would now be refracted through the lens of this moment. Survival was only the beginning. The psychological and emotional aftermath, invisible to the casual observer, had already begun to take root. And then there was the media. The inevitable, omnipresent gaze that would descend upon him within minutes. Camera flashes, reporters, and social media would transform private trauma into public spectacle. But in this instant, none of that mattered. Survival, clarity, and human connection were paramount. It was a raw, primal focus, stripped of all performance and expectation. Harry, like anyone facing sudden trauma, was now purely human. No titles, no privileges, just flesh, mind, and instinct struggling against circumstance. The minutes after the crash were a blur of motion, coordination, and sound. First responders arrived, neighbors appeared, and emergency protocols activated. Harry remained aware, conscious of both his own safety and that of others. Yet even as the world converged on the scene, there was a quiet, terrifying truth. The crash was only the beginning. The consequences would ripple outward, affecting relationships, reputation, and inner peace. What appeared as a contained event was, in reality, the start of a long, complex journey. And so, the fateful moment closes with both relief and trepidation. Harry survived the immediate danger, but the aftermath was uncertain. The collision of physics, human error, and chance had concluded, but the collision of life, emotion, and circumstance was only beginning. Every decision in the next hours would shape the trajectory of not just his physical recovery, but the narrative of his life. The story was far from over. But what came next? The rush of emergency response, the arrival of family, the first media leaks, and the quiet moments of realization would change everything in ways no one could have predicted. And as Prince Harry was whisked from the scene, the world remained unaware of the layers of trauma, conflict, and revelation that were about to unfold. The first responders arrived within minutes, though it felt like hours. Sirens pierced the night, red and blue lights flashing against the rain-soaked asphalt. For Prince Harry, every sound was amplified, every shadow exaggerated, every movement under the flashing lights a potential threat or salvation. The initial moments after a crash are often the most critical, not just for physical survival, but for the delicate balance of psychological stability. And in those minutes, Harry's instincts, training, and raw willpower would be tested in ways few could comprehend. Paramedics leapt from their vehicles with practiced efficiency, assessing the scene even as they approached. The vehicle had come to rest at a slight angle, partially on the curb, partially on the road, metal bent in violent arcs. Rain dripped steadily through shattered windows, soaking the interior. The first responders moved with urgency, but they also had to navigate the fragility of the passengers inside. One wrong motion could worsen injuries or trigger panic. In the center of it all, Prince Harry remained conscious, scanning his surroundings, gauging the situation, aware of every movement. The paramedic's first task was assessment. "Sir, are you okay? Can you move your legs? Your arms?" Questions poured rapidly, methodical yet calm, designed to both extract information and maintain composure. Harry answered carefully, mindful of the injuries he could feel but unable to see. There was pain in his shoulder, a sharp twinge in his neck, and bruises beginning to form across his torso. Yet his mind focused on coherence, not complaint. Panic could spread faster than physical injury, and the crew needed clarity, not chaos. Meanwhile, the environment outside had become chaotic. Passers-by had stopped. Cameras from nearby media outlets had begun flashing, and the distant roar of traffic added another layer of sensory overload. Harry, fully aware of his position as both a royal figure and a human in crisis, had to navigate this dual reality. He was simultaneously a patient, a survivor, and a public figure whose every move would soon be scrutinized. Even as he fought to remain calm, the awareness of what was to come pressed on him. Paramedics carefully unbuckled seatbelts and prepared to extricate him from the vehicle. Every movement was deliberate, measured, and cautious. Harry could feel the vibrations of their touch, the careful tugs and shifts of the car's seats, and the careful placement of splints and supports. His body was tense, muscles contracting reflexively in response to both pain and fear. Yet he maintained awareness, responding to instructions, offering guidance where he could, and reassuring others in the car as best he could. There is a psychological paradox that arises in moments like these. The mind struggles to reconcile relief with ongoing danger. Harry had survived the crash, yet every second brought the reality of vulnerability. The car was damaged, the environment still chaotic, and the potential for further complications high. This duality, survival and uncertainty existing simultaneously, creates a unique mental state, one that heightens stress while also sharpening focus. Harry's mental acuity remained intact, but it came at a cost. The emotional strain was immense. As the paramedics began the careful process of moving him onto a stretcher, Harry noticed small details that would stick with him later. The rain pooling on the asphalt, the way a paramedic's glove caught the light, the faint whir of an approaching helicopter in the distance. These sensory fragments, seemingly minor in isolation, became part of the indelible memory of the night. Trauma is often encoded in such fragments, sounds, smells, and visuals that later resurface with astonishing clarity. Once on the stretcher, Harry was stabilized and loaded into the ambulance. The vehicle's interior was a controlled environment compared to the chaos outside, yet it brought its own challenges. Medical equipment beeped steadily, paramedics murmured instructions, and the movement of the vehicle added jolts and vibrations. Harry gripped the sides, muscles taut, but maintained communication. He monitored his own condition, responding to questions about pain and consciousness, aware that accurate information was critical for the team managing his care. The ambulance sped through the streets, sirens blaring, navigating traffic with precision. In the back, Harry's thoughts raced. There was relief at being attended to by professionals, yet anxiety about what awaited at the hospital. Would the injuries be serious? How would family respond? How would the world react once news broke? Even in moments of physical danger, the human mind cannot separate itself from concerns of reputation, consequence, and expectation, especially for someone whose every move is subject to public scrutiny. During the ride, paramedics monitored vital signs and stabilized injuries as best they could. Every bump in the road, every turn of the vehicle, was a potential risk to the fragile equilibrium of the situation. Harry, despite the pain and the adrenaline, engaged actively with the team, asking questions, confirming procedures, and sometimes offering subtle observations about his own condition. This interaction is a testament to the resilience of human cognition under extreme stress. Even when physically compromised, the mind seeks order, comprehension, and agency. Meanwhile, the news of the accident began to trickle into public awareness. Initial reports were fragmented, some accurate, some speculative. The media, always hungry for a story, began assembling narratives before the facts were fully verified. Social media buzzed with rumor and assumption. For Harry, this was an additional, invisible layer of tension. The knowledge that while he was fighting for stability in a medical sense, his personal crisis was simultaneously becoming public spectacle. The convergence of trauma and scrutiny is uniquely challenging, and the human response to it is both fascinating and heart-wrenching. By the time the ambulance reached the hospital, Harry had been stabilized sufficiently for triage. Medical staff were waiting, briefed on the condition, and ready to act. The transition from ambulance to hospital bed, though seemingly simple, required precise coordination. Injuries had to be assessed immediately, diagnostic tests initiated, and treatment plans determined in real time. For Harry, this was the first moment when he could begin to gauge the gravity of his situation with clarity. Yet even in this relative safety, uncertainty lingered. Every decision, whether to order scans immediately, whether to administer certain medications, how to prioritize care, was a potential pivot point in his recovery. The interplay between urgency and caution defined the emergency response. It is a delicate balance that often goes unnoticed by the public, but is critical for survival in severe trauma cases. In the hours following arrival, Harry underwent initial assessments, vital signs checked, injuries cataloged, imaging initiated. The pain was present, acute and insistent, but secondary to the broader awareness of survival and consequence. He experienced a strange blend of gratitude, fear, and disbelief. Gratitude for the skills of the professionals tending to him, fear for what might be revealed in scans and tests, disbelief at how ordinary moments had converged into extraordinary trauma. And in the midst of this, the human element emerged. Nurses, doctors, paramedics, all ordinary people performing extraordinary tasks, became the immediate bridge between catastrophe and recovery. Harry's interaction with them reflected both his vulnerability and resilience. He asked questions, followed instructions, and displayed a presence of mind that belied the intensity of the events he had just endured. These small interactions, though seemingly mundane, would later stand out as key moments in his memory of survival. But even as he stabilized physically, the emotional stakes began to rise. Family members were being informed, protocols activated, and the first official statements prepared. The convergence of personal trauma, family concern, and public anticipation created a psychological storm. Harry's awareness of his own vulnerability and the simultaneous intrusion of public scrutiny intensified the strain. Survival had been achieved in the mechanical sense, but the psychological aftermath was only beginning to unfold. The emergency response phase closes with this duality. Physical survival had been secured, but emotional, psychological, and relational challenges loomed ahead. The crash was over, the ambulance ride complete, but the human consequences were only just beginning to emerge. The moment of survival would soon intersect with family dynamics, media scrutiny, and personal reflection, an intersection that would define not just recovery, but transformation. What came next? The reaction of the royal family, the media storm, and the initial steps of recovery would reveal truths that had remained hidden and forces that no one could have anticipated. But those revelations would not be immediate, and the next chapter would bring both clarity and conflict in equal measure. The moment the news of Prince Harry's accident began to leak, the world shifted. In the span of minutes, what had been a private, terrifying emergency transformed into a global spectacle. Headlines flashed, social media erupted, and newsrooms across continents scrambled for information. The mechanics of the crash, the location, and the severity of the injuries became fodder for instant analysis. And yet, amid the frenzy, the truth remained elusive, a fragmented collection of reports, speculation, and unverified eyewitness accounts. For Prince Harry, unaware of the full scale of the media storm, the intrusion began almost immediately. The first headlines reached the hospital through indirect channels. Phones buzzing, whispers in corridors, the subtle tension in the eyes of attending staff. He felt a strange mix of vulnerability and frustration. Here he was, grappling with physical pain and shock, and yet the world had already formed narratives, assigned blame, and speculated wildly. The dissonance between private reality and public perception is one of the most isolating aspects of trauma under the global gaze. Outside the hospital, the frenzy intensified. Paparazzi stationed themselves at every conceivable vantage point. Helicopters circled overhead, their rotors chopping the air like impatient questions. On social media, rumors spread faster than verified facts, exaggerated claims about his condition, conflicting reports on the cause of the crash, and personal attacks on everyone involved. The human tendency to fill gaps in knowledge with speculation became evident in full force. Every unverified claim, every distorted fact, added to the pressure, both on those close to Harry and on the public trying to understand what had happened. Editors and producers competed for breaking news. Some outlets leaned into sensationalism, publishing speculative headlines before any official confirmation. Royal tragedy, prince in peril, "Accident shocks palace." These phrases dominated feeds. Others attempted to verify details, but the speed of the digital age made accuracy a secondary concern to immediacy. The result was a chaotic mixture of truth, exaggeration, and outright fabrication. For those involved, this was more than a media headache. It was a psychological assault, a distortion of reality that would shape public perception for weeks, if not months. In the hospital, staff tried to shield Harry from the worst of it. Security measures intensified, limiting access and creating a controlled environment. Yet even these precautions could not fully insulate him from the global curiosity. He knew that any moment could be captured, misrepresented, or broadcast without context. The awareness of constant surveillance, combined with the trauma of the accident itself, created a tension that was both exhausting and unnerving. Trauma under scrutiny is a peculiar state. The body survives, but the mind is constantly negotiating between self-preservation and the inevitability of public judgment. The role of social media in this episode cannot be overstated. Platforms lit up with speculation, memes, and commentary. Eyewitness accounts, often inaccurate, were amplified by algorithms. The speed at which unverified information spread created a feedback loop. Journalists referenced social posts, which in turn became cited as sources, further muddying the waters. For a public figure like Harry, this digital environment is a double-edged sword. Instant awareness of public concern, coupled with relentless exposure to distortion and misrepresentation. And yet, amid the chaos, there were surprising contradictions. Some reports emphasized the severity of his injuries, suggesting near-fatal outcomes. Others downplayed the incident, framing it as a minor collision blown out of proportion. These conflicting narratives exemplified the tension between rumor and reality. For those close to Harry, this was infuriating and frightening. Misrepresentation not only risked misunderstanding his condition, but also threatened the delicate network of family and personal relationships already strained by the accident. The media frenzy chapter closes on a note of anticipation and unresolved tension. Headlines had been written, narratives constructed, and speculation had run rampant. Yet the most significant consequences, emotional, relational, and personal, were only beginning to unfold. For Prince Harry, surviving the crash was only the start. Navigating the aftermath, with scrutiny and distortion at every turn, would test him in ways the public could scarcely imagine. What comes next? The reaction of the royal family, the private confrontations, and the initial emotional reckonings would reveal deeper truths about loyalty, fear, and resilience. And as the media machine continued to churn, the real story remained hidden behind flashes of light, headlines, and rumor. But the moments that followed would set the stage for revelations that no one anticipated, and the next chapter would bring both confrontation and reflection in equal measure. Behind the closed doors of the palace, the news of Prince Harry's accident landed like a thunderclap. The corridors, usually calm under the weight of centuries of routine, buzzed with tension. Advisors, aides, and family members moved swiftly, coordinating responses, preparing statements, and attempting to contain both the practical and emotional fallout. What the world saw as a brief headline, a shocking but sanitized version of events, was, behind the scenes, a storm of worry, urgency, and unspoken fears that threatened to ripple through the monarchy. The initial reaction from the family was complex, layered with affection, frustration, and the ever-present pressure of protocol. Parents, siblings, and close relatives responded differently, each guided by their own priorities and emotions. For some, the immediate concern was for Harry's physical well-being, ensuring he was receiving the best possible care, that no further danger threatened him. For others, the focus was on public perception, controlling narratives, managing appearances, and protecting the institution from scrutiny or scandal. The collision of these perspectives created both conflict and tension, revealing fractures in relationships that were often invisible to the public eye. Messages poured in. Urgent phone calls, discreet visits, and a flurry of texts between aides and family members. The palace's internal communications reflected the urgency of the situation. One aide reportedly noted the anxiety in the tone of messages. Even in carefully worded sentences, The undercurrent of fear and anticipation was palpable. Decisions about who should visit, what should be said publicly, and how to handle the inevitable media inquiries had to be made in real time, each carrying potential consequences. For Harry, however, the royal reaction was a double-edged sword. Family concern offered comfort and reassurance, but it also carried implicit judgment. There were questions, some unspoken, some expressed, that cut deeper than any physical injury. Why had he been in that situation? Could it have been avoided? What message did this accident send to the public and the monarchy? Within these questions lay an emotional minefield: guilt, defensiveness, and the need for explanation, all in a moment when he was still processing shock and pain. The monarchy itself, as an institution, had to weigh appearances against reality. Every decision would be scrutinized: who would speak publicly, how much detail could be released, and what tone should be struck in statements. Advisors moved to balance transparency with discretion, aware that any misstep could become a headline and exacerbate the already volatile media situation. For those within the palace walls, it was a delicate dance between empathy for Harry's condition and the necessity of upholding the dignity and composure expected of royalty. Tension intensified when the media began to circulate conflicting reports about the family's response. Some outlets suggested panic or discord, while others framed the response as calm and measured. The family's private deliberations, invisible to the public, became a battleground of interpretation. For Harry, this added another layer of pressure. Not only was he recovering physically and mentally, but he now had to navigate the labyrinth of familial expectations and institutional scrutiny. The weight of both personal and public judgment loomed large, compounding the trauma of the accident itself. Even within the family, opinions varied on the appropriate course of action. Some advocated for immediate visits and visible support, emphasizing empathy and presence. Others preferred a more controlled approach, limiting exposure to preserve both Harry's privacy and the image of the institution. The friction between these approaches highlighted long-standing differences in perspective and approach, differences that had existed before the accident but were now intensified by crisis. For Harry, witnessing this tension was a sobering reminder that survival was only part of the challenge. He now had to navigate a complex web of loyalty, expectation, and emotion. In parallel, private communications between family members revealed underlying anxieties and unspoken fears. Messages hinted at frustration, guilt, and even subtle blame. There were debates over how to manage public statements, how to reassure concerned friends and advisors, and how to maintain an appearance of unity. These conversations, though conducted with discretion, added to the emotional weight Harry carried. The intersection of personal vulnerability and institutional expectation created a pressure cooker atmosphere, one in which every word, gesture, and decision was laden with consequence. At the same time, Harry's close allies, trusted friends and aides, worked tirelessly to provide emotional support. They acted as intermediaries, helping to shield him from excessive scrutiny while offering grounding presence in the hospital. Their presence highlighted the stark contrast between the controlled, measured world of royal protocol and the chaotic, raw reality of human trauma. For Harry, these moments of private connection offered a reprieve from both pain and expectation, a temporary sanctuary amid the storm. Yet, even in these moments, the psychological tension was palpable. The knowledge that his condition would soon be public, combined with the high stakes of royal image management, created an emotional tightrope. Harry experienced a complex interplay of relief, anxiety, and frustration. Relief that family and professionals were present and supportive, anxiety over public perception and personal vulnerability, frustration at the implicit judgment embedded in even the most well-intentioned gestures. The emotional texture of the hours following the crash was dense, contradictory, and exhausting. As night fell, the palace continued to operate in a heightened state of alert. Security protocols were reinforced, staff were briefed on expected media intrusion, and preparations for formal statements began. Behind the scenes, advisors debated language, timing, and tone. Every phrase mattered. A single poorly chosen word could fuel speculation, criticism, or scandal. The careful orchestration of these responses highlighted the unique pressures faced by a royal family in crisis, where empathy, accuracy, and diplomacy must coexist in perfect balance. For Harry, the royal reaction was a microcosm of the larger tension between public duty and private reality. He was at once a son, a brother, a patient, and a symbol. Each role carried its own expectations, and the collision of these identities created both emotional strain and profound insight. Harry's awareness of these dynamics, even while processing shock and injury, demonstrated the resilience and adaptability that would become defining characteristics in the aftermath of the crash. But cracks were already visible. Behind measured statements and calm appearances, there were subtle fractures, moments of frustration, whispered disagreements, and quiet tension. These fissures, invisible to the public, would later become significant in understanding both family dynamics and Harry's personal journey. The interplay between loyalty, expectation, and autonomy emerged as a central theme, one that would influence decisions, relationships, and the path toward recovery. As the hours progressed, the initial shock gave way to a deeper understanding. Survival was only the beginning. The royal reaction, while outwardly composed, revealed both support and strain, love and expectation, protection and implicit judgment. Harry was not just recovering from a car crash. He was navigating an intricate web of human emotion, institutional demands, and public scrutiny. The duality of his experience, personal trauma intersecting with public narrative, would shape the coming days, weeks, and months in ways that were only beginning to emerge. And so, the royal reaction chapter closes with tension unresolved. The family had responded with urgency, care, and discretion, yet the emotional and institutional complexities remained. Harry's survival was confirmed, but the psychological, relational, and public consequences of the crash were only beginning to manifest. What would come next? The hospital recovery, private confrontations, and early media statements would test his resilience in ways that few could imagine. But the aftermath of the family's response would collide with an even larger force: the relentless scrutiny of the media and the swirling narratives constructed by the public. And in that collision, the next chapter would reveal both the power and the peril of living life under constant observation. The hospital room was quiet, almost deceptively calm. Outside, the world was a storm of flashing lights, frantic speculation, and media frenzy. But inside, the sterile walls, soft hum of medical equipment, and occasional footsteps of nurses created a controlled environment where Prince Harry could finally begin to process what had happened. Yet even in this relative sanctuary, the weight of the night's events hung heavily, as if each breath carried the echo of metal twisting, glass shattering, and the sudden, terrifying awareness of mortality. Harry's injuries were, by most accounts, survivable. There were bruises, abrasions, and the expected soreness from the violent impact, but nothing that immediately threatened life. Yet survival is only the beginning. The real challenge lies in recovery, both physical and emotional. For Harry, this meant navigating pain, disorientation, and fatigue, while simultaneously processing the psychological shock of the crash and the knowledge that his personal trauma had become a global spectacle. The interplay of physical pain and mental strain would define the first hours of his recovery. From the moment he arrived, medical staff worked with precision. Vital signs were monitored continuously, imaging scans were performed to rule out internal injuries, and pain management was administered with careful consideration. Harry, though still in shock, participated actively, answering questions and following instructions. The process of triage and stabilization was meticulous, designed to prevent complications and ensure rapid intervention if new issues arose. Yet despite the clinical efficiency, the human dimension, the empathy, the quiet reassurances, the gentle presence of nurses and doctors was what provided a grounding force amid the chaos of the night. The first night in the hospital was a strange blend of physical recovery and emotional turbulence. Sleep was elusive. Every creak of the building, every distant sound from the hallway, reminded Harry that the world outside was still spinning, still observing. Memories of the crash replayed unbidden. The lurch of the car, the screeching of tires, the violent jolt, the flurry of sirens. These flashbacks were interspersed with worry for his family, speculation about public perception, and the gnawing question, what would this mean for the days ahead? The trauma was not just bodily, it was existential. Survival had been achieved, but comprehension of the experience had only just begun. Family visits were carefully orchestrated. Close relatives arrived, bringing both comfort and subtle tension. Words of reassurance mixed with expressions of concern, and even subtle glances communicated volumes. Harry felt the duality of these interactions acutely. The warmth of care contrasted with the weight of expectation. Each conversation, each gesture, carried layers of meaning. Some intentional, some unconscious. For someone in his position, this balancing act, between accepting care and maintaining autonomy, was emotionally exhausting, yet crucial for navigating both recovery and relationships. Physical therapy and routine assessments began the following day. Simple movements, raising an arm, shifting position, walking a few steps, became exercises in discipline and patience. Pain flared unexpectedly, but each small victory brought a sense of agency. Recovery, Harry realized, was not linear. It was a series of micro-challenges, each requiring focus, resilience, and mental fortitude. Even mundane actions, sitting up without assistance, moving from bed to wheelchair, took on heightened significance. In these moments, the contrast between vulnerability and strength became stark, illuminating the human capacity to adapt and persevere under pressure. Psychological recovery, however, proved even more complex. Trauma manifests in unpredictable ways. Anxiety, hypervigilance, sleep disturbances, and intrusive memories all emerged in varying degrees. Harry experienced waves of emotion, relief, guilt, fear, and frustration, sometimes simultaneously. The presence of trained mental health professionals provided support. Yet even with guidance, processing a near-death experience under public scrutiny was uniquely challenging. The mind, much like the body, required care, attention, and gradual acclimation to the altered reality. During this period, the intrusion of the media continued indirectly. Headlines flashed across screens outside the hospital room. Social media posts proliferated, and leaks, both accurate and speculative, filtered through aides and intermediaries. Harry had to negotiate a delicate balance, remain informed enough to understand public perception, yet shield himself from overwhelming stress. Even the act of being aware carried a psychological toll. Survival was no longer just about physical recovery. It was about managing attention, stress, and the constant awareness of a world watching intently. Interactions with staff became a source of both support and grounding. Nurses who had worked in trauma recovery for years understood not just the physical requirements, but the emotional needs of patients. They offered gentle reminders, empathetic words, and structured routines that provided Harry with a sense of stability. In moments of vulnerability, shivers from pain, difficulty moving, the occasional flashback, they acted as anchors, grounding him in the present and offering reassurance that recovery was possible. These human connections underscored a vital truth. While media narratives and public scrutiny dominate perception, recovery is ultimately a deeply human, relational process. Gradually, Harry began to engage in light physical activity. Short walks down corridors, simple stretching exercises, and controlled breathing routines became milestones. Each small accomplishment boosted confidence, reinforced resilience, and countered the helplessness that often accompanies trauma. Yet, even these achievements were tempered by caution. Recovery required patience, respect for limitations, and careful monitoring. For someone accustomed to autonomy and action, this measured approach demanded both discipline and humility. Meanwhile, family continued to navigate their own emotions. Some sought reassurance, others offered guidance, and still others wrestled with guilt or regret, questions about whether anything could have been done to prevent the crash. These dynamics, subtle yet powerful, added emotional complexity to Harry's recovery. He found himself mediating between his own needs, the family's expectations, and the procedural requirements of medical care. The psychological balancing act was ongoing, demanding resilience, clarity, and focus. In the hospital, moments of reflection emerged. Harry considered the fragility of life, the randomness of the accident, and the profound lessons inherent in survival. He pondered relationships, choices, and personal responsibility. These reflections were punctuated by practical considerations, managing future travel, ensuring safety protocols, and preparing for eventual public statements. Recovery, he realized, was not solely about healing the body. It was about reconciling the personal, relational, and public dimensions of a profoundly destabilizing event. By the end of the first week, physical improvements were visible. Bruises began to fade, soreness decreased, and mobility increased. Psychological resilience, however, required more time. Flashbacks, heightened anxiety, and the awareness of media attention persisted. Yet each day offered incremental progress, small victories that cumulatively built confidence and stability. Recovery, Harry understood, was not linear. It was a continuous interplay between physical restoration, emotional processing, and social navigation. And even as progress continued, the knowledge remained. Life had changed in irrevocable ways. The crash, survival, and initial recovery had created a turning point. Relationships would be tested, public perception would evolve, and personal priorities would shift. Recovery was no longer just a personal journey. It was a crucible for transformation, resilience, and the redefinition of identity under extraordinary circumstances. The chapter closes on a moment of cautious hope. Harry had survived. He was healing, and small victories signaled the possibility of full recovery. Yet the road ahead was long, fraught with emotional, relational, and public challenges. The hospital had provided safety, medical expertise, and initial guidance, but the psychological and social consequences were only beginning to unfold. What would follow? The interplay of media narratives, family dynamics, and personal reflection would define the next phase of his journey, revealing the complex human reality behind the headlines. The first official statements about Prince Harry's accident were released with careful precision, the result of intense deliberation between palace advisors, communications teams, and medical professionals. Every word, every phrase, was scrutinized for tone, accuracy, and potential public reaction. The goal was simple in theory: provide reassurance, acknowledge the event, and maintain dignity. Yet in practice, achieving this balance proved extraordinarily difficult. A single misstep could ignite criticism, speculation, or even scandal. The statement began with the basic facts. Prince Harry had been involved in a car crash, he had sustained minor injuries, and he was receiving appropriate medical care. It expressed gratitude to emergency services and urged privacy for the family during a difficult time. On paper, it was measured and professional. But in the era of social media and instantaneous news cycles, measured professionalism often fails to satisfy the public's appetite for drama, speculation, and narrative closure. Within minutes of the release, reactions began to pour in from across the globe. Social media exploded with commentary, ranging from concern and support to criticism and judgment. Some praised the palace for transparency, others accused it of downplaying the severity of the crash. Bloggers and tabloid journalists dissected every word, phrase, and omission, searching for hidden meanings or inconsistencies.